we're back from break, and thanks for continuing to watch Douglas on My Mind. Joining me on the show now is Mr. Don Brooks, who is one of the person that was very instrumental in the formation of the 63rd Preservation Society, which birthed the World War II Flight Training Museum. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Georgia. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Glad to have you here. And talking about the World War II Flight Training Museum, that is a jewel in our community that some people we can say know about, but there's still a lot that really does not know a whole lot about it. So if you would today start by telling us, how did we acquire this World War II museum at our flight training base in Douglas?
Okay. You know, it might help to go back to, early history of our airport. We're fortunate here in Douglas that we've had city and county leaders that have understood the importance of an airport to a community.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, our airport goes back to 1926. Of course, that was a year that Charles Lindbergh was the first man to fly an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean, and a lot of the communities all over the United States decided they needed airports if they were going to, be modern and grow. And it was surprising to me that even back in 1926, our leaders decided we needed an airport here in Douglas. And so we were fortunate to have South Georgia College here, and South Georgia actually started the first airport here in 1926. And of course, they had one of the flight instructors accompanied a guy from Macon that came down to Douglas to give flight training was Wesley Raymond. And in years later, he would be the person that would come back here and actually start the civilian pilot training school that was based in Douglas.
And that he did. And in 1938, most of the world was, already engaged in a bit of war. But how did this lead to the flight training base here in Douglas in our community?
Good question. Most of the war, Europe and the Pacific nations, most of them were heavily into World War II at that time. And of course, the United States had not been drawn into the war. But our leaders could see that at some point we would be pulled into World War II. And of course, in 1937, the U.S. actually had a very small Air Force. I mean, any of a dozen other countries could have wiped our Air Force out in one day. So, World War I was a war when you used a lot of men and big cannons, and airplanes were just coming into being, and they were used really mostly for observation and spotting. But by the time World War II came around, airplanes had advanced to the point that if you didn't control the airspace, there's no way that you were going to win the battle and win the war. So we knew how important air power was, but we were way behind the curve. We were behind the rest of the world really in air power. So one of the biggest needs that we had was to try to get our Air Force up to speed.
You had to get them trained.
That's right. And of course, at that time, we were only equipped to train a few hundred pilots a year. And we could see that if we were going to be a factor in this war, that we needed to be able to train from 100 to 200,000 pilots a year.
Wow.
So to think about that kind of increase overnight was really a challenge for our planners. And one of the solutions they came up with was to form civilian pilot training program schools. And that's where they could take existing flight schools and contract with them to actually provide the primary training instructors for all of these cadets. And under that program, most of those schools were set up in the southeastern United States because the weather was good and we had plenty of open land. And the guy we talked about earlier, Wesley Raymond,
that's right,
was in the flight training business, so he remembered South Georgia College Field, and he knew that Douglas would be a good place for one of these schools. So he actually made a bid to put one of the contract schools here in Douglas. Our local business and governmental leaders were behind it 100%. And of course, it was good for the community because we were really just beginning to come out of the Great Depression, and it created a lot of good jobs,
Yes.
part-time and full-time. The Raymond Richardson Flight School was started here in 1940. The Army Corps of Engineers actually engineered and started construction on the buildings. Our first class of cadets actually came here from West Point, and they finished their flight training just before Pearl Harbor, just before December the 7th, 1941. You know, the cadets that trained here actually learned to fly. Their first experience with flying was in a Stearman PT-17 biplane. And there were 140 of those airplanes here, and of course local people did the maintenance on them and serviced them. And of course all these cadets were actually in the military, even though they had civilian instructors. And of course their organization was the 63rd Flight Training Detachment. And you know, they had the U.S. military did have people here to teach military discipline and protocol, and make sure. They also had check pilots, so when a cadet reached a certain point, he'd have to ride with an actual military instructor to make sure that the training was up to the standards that the
I can
Army
imagine.
wanted. So anyway, during the war, the 63rd Flight Training Detachment had about 10,000 cadets come through this school. And of course, they were, you know, they would wash them out or flunk them out of the school for almost anything, and that was just part of the program. So they flunked out about 30% of the cadets. So, you know, I think about 7,000 actually learned to fly here. And of course, after 2 different courses of study, they would move on to a basic training facility, and after that, they would move on to advanced training facility where they would either learn to fly fighter planes, or they'd move them into cargo planes or bombers, and they would, you know, go on to the war then.
Well, I know this community was very fortunate to have that many cadets. You say over 10,000 to come through for their primary flight training, and while they were here, that base became like a little community out there. So what type of programs or activities took place while the base was in operation?
Well, they had of course, flying was number one, but they had a lot of time that they would learn navigation. They would learn ground training. They actually had small arms training with handguns. And you know, we had a link trainer building out there that had about a dozen link trainers, which were early instrument training aircraft. And I was a little surprised that a primary flight school would begin to teach instrument training, because that's a lot more advanced than the primary normally has. But that's one of the things that we have in our museum is one of the link trainers, you know, like they used during World War II.
Well, and that segues into, tell us now, out of that and all the history, how is it that the World War II Flight Training Museum came to be?
Well, again, this base is unusual because there was one instructor here, Paul Slunt, that was an instructor from the beginning all the way to the end of the flight training here. And after the war was over, he started flying with a corporation as a corporate pilot. And of course, his hobby, he wanted to try to track down every cadet that was in every class that went through here. And he wanted to document who was in each class, you know, what they did during the war, and of course, if they survived the war, you know, what they did after the war. So as a result of his efforts over the years, the 63rd Flight Training Detachment actually ended up with a reunion organization. And that was, you know, really unheard of. You hear some fighter group units or bomber group units that do have reunions, but never a primary flight training base. So, but anyway, Paul and his group started meeting 25 years ago, maybe 30, and Douglas didn't have enough motel rooms, so they would have their reunion down at Jekyll Island where there were plenty of rooms. And I can remember when they would bring 4 or 5 large tour buses of cadets to Douglas for one day to visit the base. And of course, you've helped. A lot of people have helped with those folks over the years, and they love Douglas, and they're still coming back to Douglas.
Well, it went from one day to an entire week, didn't it?
That's right. So, but they're still coming back to Douglas and plan to come back this next October again. You know, so. But I think those people being so involved with us locally, you know, it led, you know, a group of us that worked with them to come up with the idea that we really needed to put a museum out there at the base to help honor those people, honor all of our veterans, and to help keep their memory alive, you know, and let people know that Douglas did play a big part in the war, World War II, and the guys that trained here were a big part of winning that war. So, you know, there was a group of local people, myself, Vic Suttles, Joey Hand, James Wiles, Todd Womack, Jim Rhymes, quite a few that wanted to try to help put this museum together. So we started the 63rd Preservation Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And of course, we leased one of the barracks buildings from the city, and we restored the building and started that museum. And of course, we've been building it ever since. And you know, we're really proud that the Douglas Air Base now is on the National Register of Historic Places. True. And you know, our museum is open from you know, 10 o'clock until 4 o'clock Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We have a great website, you know, if people want to learn more about our museum or our air base, they can go on the internet and look up the World War II Flight Training Museum.org.
Yes.
And they can, you know, we have people from all over the United States that contact us because they're looking for information on their relatives that served in World War II, and they'll put in their name and it'll bring them right to our website. So we have cadets listed, and we get people from all over that come here. But we're really proud of our museum. This air base, this primary flight training base, is the most complete of anyone in the United States from World War II.
That is true.
And you know, so many people have helped. Jackie Wilson helped us a couple of times over the years to get the money to put new roofs on buildings, and she helped us find some grant money, and you know, but it's been a big group of people in Douglas that have worked hard to preserve this air base, and you know, and I know the future, in the future, people will come to appreciate it and realize what a treasure we really have here in Douglas. It
is definitely a treasure, and if the community, anyone watching have not seen it, please find a way, if you're in town or don't have anything to do on a Thursday through Saturday, as you said, from 10 to 4, go by and visit. And we are grateful that you, along with the names that you called out, and formed the 63rd Preservation Society group to maintain just many artifacts of history from World War II and the base from that time. If you will, before you go, with all of that you do and the history associated, do you ever have a need for volunteers and contributions to keep the museum going? We
do, Georgia. We survive on contributions from the local community, and are very appreciative of all that everyone's done and continues to do to help us. But volunteers are always needed. We have plenty of jobs, large and small. And if anybody's interested in possibly being a volunteer, helping us with any of the duties that we have to do, I would just suggest that you either contact me, Don Brooks, or you could go by the museum during the hours that it's open and let the lady there, let our docent know that you know you're possibly interested in helping or volunteering, and she can help you follow through and maybe find some way that you could help us. And of course, we're collecting memorabilia, pictures from World War II. You know, a lot of people here have relatives that worked on the base. We would really love to know more about the relatives, local people that worked on that base. Certainly any pictures or just their names and what they did. Okay. All of that information would be great. And of course, any kind of donations that could help our collection there, or money that could